The parable that we're dealing with today will sort of bridge this debate that's going on currently amongst New Testament scholars about the interpretation of parables, in which some of the more traditional ways of reading the parables are now being challenged when the parables are set in the kind of social, economic, political structures of the first century. So that's what's going on. So this parable will be a good test to see what the discussion is all about and why it's going that way. The parable we have exists in two different forms. One of them is in Matthew 25 and the other is in Luke 19. The context, not only are, but the versions are quite the same. For one thing, in Matthew, the word that they're entrusted with is talent, which is 15 years. That's a lot of money. 15 years of wages for a peasant to make a talent. Whereas mina, in the Lucan version, is what he hands out. That's only 3 months of wages. So there's a considerable difference in the amount of money. Matthew is incredibly exaggerated and so forth. In Luke, it's less. The context of the parables in the two Gospels are quite different. Matthew has set the parable toward the end in what's called the eschatological section of Matthew. That is, Matthew is now giving a series of sayings and stories, preparing people for the final judgment before they enter heaven. And so this parable is part of that structure of the final judgment that's being set up. In Luke's context, Luke, I should say both writers of Matthew and Luke, both authors, exist after the war in Jerusalem. In 70, it's over. Jerusalem was destroyed, Roman power had exerted itself and so forth. But during the war and immediately afterwards, there was great expectation in not only the Jewish but Christian communities that the war signaled the end of the world. That was what was in most of the apocalyptic texts of the time, that the war would happen, and when that happened, God would intervene, the angels would end the world. Well, of course, what happened is the Romans won, and that sort of shook up the apocalyptic view of things. But Christians still had the assumption that the end of the world would happen. It was supposed to happen within the lifetime of the people who were alive in the first centuries, and they anticipated the second coming with Jesus coming back. But it wasn't happening nearly as quickly. So Luke introduces the parable by saying Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. As they heard these things, he proceeded to tell a parable because he was near to Jerusalem, and because they supposed the kingdom of God was to appear immediately. He said, therefore, a nobleman went into a far country. So what happens is, in Luke's parables, almost always the central person goes away for a long time. Won't be back soon. And all of this is to suggest the time between now and the end is a lot longer than we think. And the author of Luke writes the book of Acts and now says there's going to be a period of church history to deal with. So that process is getting longer. Matthew thinks it will be delayed too, because in his parable he has the man go up for a long time. But nevertheless, neither Luke nor Matthew completely abandon the idea that there will be some last judgment. It's just the timetable has been changed. So what you have, though, in Luke, though, is also Luke takes two stories and combines them into one and changes the force of the parable, that's at least the form of it that's in Matthew, because he says when the nobleman went into a far country, he goes in the country to receive a kingdom in return. Think of the author's allegorical reading now. Jesus went to heaven, to the far country. He becomes king now next to God, and one day the king will come back again. That's the introduction to the parable. And then he talks about the servants coming, gives 10 pounds to one, says trade. And then 14 says, but the citizens hated him. What's that got to do with trading the money? And sent an embassy after him saying, we don't want this man to reign over us. What Luke has done is taken a parable about a king claiming his throne and the citizens rebelling against the king and not letting him reign. And what we find in Matthew is entrusting money to traders to go to work. By putting the two together, the problem is the last person who doesn't do his job becomes symbolic of somebody who doesn't want Jesus to be his king. And therefore in Luke, the real story is, will you accept the new kingdom that Jesus is reigning over or not? And those who don't, in Luke, who don't accept that, I tell you, everyone who has will more be given, from whom has not will be taken away. But as for these enemies of mine who do not want me to reign over them, bring them here and I'll slay them. That's not exactly the theme of love and justice that we normally think of in this case. So what Luke has done has taken the image of the war, taken the issue of a story about a king claiming it, and then combines them together to say, this is why what happened in the past happened. So he's changed the thrust of the parable, at least in the form that it's in Matthew. Matthew, as you will see, makes some changes in it too, by adding in verses 21 and 23, when they get their final reward, not only does he give the guys more talents, but it says, enter into the joy of your master, which means you get to go to heaven. So Matthew has changed the story to the ultimate great thing that you get is not all the money, but reward in heaven. So Matthew has put that into his context. So they have different contexts in the two stories. The two stories are different not only with regard to this, but the action of the third person is very critical in the two versions of the story. If you remember the first one, it says when he gives it to him, you have a rich man, he has clients. He's giving money to clients and telling them to go out and make more money, in effect. And so he says he received one gets 5 talents. You see how much money that is in that scheme of things? Bruce, even you could invest this. This would be a bonanza. And then he gives 2 talents to the other and 1 talent to the third person. And what happens is the 5-talent person doubles the money, the 2-talent person doubles the money, but in Matthew, the third person digs a hole in the ground, puts it in the ground, and covers it back up. In Luke, it doesn't tell us exactly how they go about it until they come back and tells us what happened. It just says the first one doubled it, second one doubled it, and the third one it says put it in a napkin. Well, you can't put a talent in a napkin, believe me. That's, we'd fill up the room with coin. You could put that much in a napkin, but buried in the ground in that culture is like putting it into a secure safe. It's absolutely protected. Nobody's going to find it. A napkin is very risky. So the third person's action in Luke is irresponsible. It's not irresponsible in Matthew to dig a hole and put it there. That's keeping it safe. So there's a difference in the two parables. In some sense, the Matthew's third person has something of an excuse. I took care of it. In Luke, he has no excuse. He was irresponsible by putting it in a napkin. So he's really going to get it in Luke. They both, in effect, lose everything at the end. But there's a difference in how to regard the action of the third person in the two different versions. Now, most scholars, if not all, most, pick Matthew as the more prevalent form because Luke has combined different stories and makes really the issue is who doesn't accept the king rather than what's done with the money. Now, what you have in both cases then is in a sense a story which deals with a test. What are you going to do with what you've been given? That's the issue. Now, the dominant way to read these stories, and still is the more prevalent way to read the stories, is to read the story from the perspective of the wealthy person who hands out the money. So if we take it from that point of view, let's listen to the story again. I'll read Matthew's version and leave out what most people think are Matthew's additions. For it will be as when a man going on a journey called his servants, those are the people that work for him. Now this is what you call a client system. a wealthy man can hire clients to work for him, and if the clients don't do what he wants, he's got 45 million other clients waiting to get the job. So you can, it's like last week with, remember, the day laborers? There are so many day laborers, if one doesn't do what you want, you can always go get more. And as Jim was pointing out, we were talking after class, in fact, part of the rules, you don't want to hire the same day laborers twice in a row, it gives them too much authority. You want to keep them off balance. Well, it's the same thing for people who are working for you. If they don't do your job, you're out. So the clients are given, and it says, he gave each one according to their ability. Not quite clear what the word ability means in this case, but in any case, we'll come back to it. Then he goes away. He who had received 5 talents went at once and traded with them and makes 5 talents more. Also he had 2 talents, made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. Now after a long time, hear the delay, the master of the servants came and settled accounts with them. And he who had received 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more, saying, Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. Here I have made 5 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over little, I will set you over much. And he also, who had the 2 talents, came forward, saying, Master, you delivered to me 2 talents. Here I have made 2 talents more. Both doubled the money. So apparently their ability was pretty equal since they could double the money. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful a little, I will set you over much. He who had received the 1 talent came forward and said, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you did not winnow. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here is what he gives him back his 1 talent. But his master said to him, You wicked and slothful servant, you knew that I reap where I have not sowed and gather where I have not winnowed. Then you ought to have invested my money with bankers, and at my coming I should have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to him who has the 10 talents. So the 10 talent guy now gets another talent. And then Matthew's comment outside the parable is, For everyone who has will more be given, and he will have abundance. But from him who has not, even what he has not will be taken away. That can't be too literal, I guess. But and the wicked, slothful one is cast into the outer darkness. So if that's read from the vantage point of the wealthy person, as many have seen it done, then what you have is a test. And the issue becomes then, in the parable, the owner who does the work becomes a God image. God gives us all according to our ability. You've heard this all your life, I assume. And what you do with your ability will depend on what you are, and in Matthew's case, what you will ultimately be judged as. And what happens in the third case is that the person is controlled by fear. He's afraid. And being afraid, he hides it in the ground and doesn't do anything with it. Therefore, it's fear that strangles him. There are a number of other books I could bring in, but Dan Vaya, for example, in his interpretation of parable, picks up the issue of fear and then deals with it in a modern psychological sense. What happens to us as human beings when we are controlled by fear? We are unable to do anything. We live our lives defensively, all other stuff that you can go on with. And therefore, what God requires of us is to not give in to fears, but to be courageous and move forward and so forth on into life. So that many of the parable interpretations will pick up that theme and indicate that what you need to do then is to overcome fear. And that seems to be one of the dominant ways to begin interpreting that particular parable. Now, if you put it in the context, the question keeps coming up, is the third servant correct in his interpretation of this wealthy man or not? When the third servant says, I was afraid of you because you're a mean-hearted man,
and I know what you've done. And in order to protect myself from your meanness, I kept it safe. The question would come up, what would happen if he went out to trade it and lost it all? What do you think the guy would say to him then? If he already took it for doing nothing, took it away from him and cast him into outer darkness, what would he do to him if he lost it? Well, it's okay. So part of the question mark in terms of the hearing of the audience is, who is the audience beginning to be sympathetic to? So is there anything in the parable that would make us think that the third person's opinion of the rich man is correct, or is the man correct and benevolent, and is his actions in effect fair? That's part of the debate that's going on. Well, for those who take the side of the wealthy person then, there's nothing in the parable that says he isn't fair. He treats the people who did what they wanted with fairness and offers it what he can. He even then confronts the said, if you really thought that, then you could have gotten it with bank. This is not a capitalist system, by the way, so the terrible tendency is for us to think capitalism. But even if you gave it to a banker and got some interest, at least, by the way, giving it to a banker is not a safe thing to do in the first century. I don't know, we got all kinds of insurances these days, but in the first century, bankers could lose money just as well as anybody else. So it's not necessarily a safe bet. You could get interest if the bankers did it, but that would be a minimal return on your money if you did that. It would be some return, but minimal. So, yeah.
What is the general attitude of the person, scholars about why did the guy take it to begin with when he knew the guy was very demanding? Is there any reasoning that goes into that? Or
well, he was one of his servants, if you will. He was one of the client's servants. He did have a job, but he saw his job in particular as keeping the money safe rather than going out and risking it.
But if he knew that he was a hard master, why did he take the money to begin with?
He'd be out of a job.
Okay.
I mean, if he quit, he could have said, no, I know about you, I'm quitting. The next day, he's a day laborer. Okay? So that's part of the problem. So part of the question mark that comes up is about this whole business of what's going on here. But now, Bernard Brandon Scott, whom I said is one of the major interpreters now, he has picked up what he thinks is a theme that is in the Jewish text about such kinds of things. If God is the figure, then giving the people the talent is in the mythological scheme of the first century, a theme which is equivalent to what do you do with regard to the Torah and the tradition. So the story becomes a story about God. The talent becomes, in effect, a symbol of the tradition or the Torah. What do you do when you're given the Torah or God's revelation? Do you sit on it and bury it and keep it without changing it, moving it, keeping it safe? Or do you go out and risk, almost like the sermons were, do you go out and risk to change things, transform things? And what he does with that interpretation is he says that what happens then, if that's what the story is about, then by burying it in the ground, while you're preserving the past, you have excluded the future. So you have, and therefore this is what, from his point of view, is the debate between Jesus and the Pharisees. The Pharisees take the Torah or the law and want to strictly maintain it on the basis of the past. In effect, they hide it in the ground and preserve it. Jesus is taking the Torah or the law and transforming it so it moves toward love and justice. So in that sense then, the third worker becomes emblematic of the Pharisees who try to preserve the tradition at the cost of the future, whereas Jesus wants to take the risk and move it on into another direction. And that becomes his interpretation of it based upon what he thinks are major themes taking place in the first century. So in effect, he turns against his own scholarly assumptions that the parables are parables, not allegory. His interpretation becomes an allegory. But it's an interesting one. Now, the question, though, that comes up now in the other side of this is what happens if you take the point of view of the third person in the story and what he's afraid of. Is there anything in the story that gives us pause to wonder? Part of what we have to do in order to raise these kind of questions is to have a much better sense of the economy in the first century. I've already mentioned this is a huge amount of money. And what you have to see in the first century is then you're living with a pyramid of power. You're not in a capitalist system where you can continue to grow capital and everybody can benefit and everybody can get richer. You have a finite amount of resources in the first century. So if you're going to take 5 talents and double it to 5 talents, that if you just think of what you've just done now, if you've made 5 talents more, what is that? 75 years of wages have been taken away from others. It's not like everybody can grow and benefit as in a capitalist system. You have finite resources. If you gain 2, somebody had to lose 2. So what do you think it's going to be if these guys go out and double that money in a short period of time? How are they going to double that money in a short period of time? They have to rip people off. There's no other way to do it in that culture. And so when the third person says to him, you reap where you didn't sow, you gather where you didn't minnow, that's a way of saying you've been stealing from people all the way along the line. And the guy never denies it. He didn't say, you're calling me a crook, I'm not a crook. The guy's greedy. He really is. That's what he wants. He's rewarding people for making money, in his case. And so there's pretty good indication you've got a problem on your hands in terms of this guy really is that way. And then he says to him, if you knew I was a big crook, you could have done something to get rid of the problem. You at least get some interest. Well, the guy's afraid he's going to lose it. So he is afraid of the guy. In this case, his fear is founded, well-founded, because the guy is a manipulator. In order to do this, okay, we'll start back with some of our social political analysis. The urban centers were where the wealthy lived, and they were the ones that in that first study, controlled the economies. That's where the guys could collect tolls, taxes, they all went there. Now, what you have in Galilee, though, by the first century when Jesus is living, let's just say this is the Galilee region. Upper Galilee here, the major crop in Upper Galilee are olive trees, they make olive oil. And then the southern area where there was a richer farmland, it's where they grew most of the wheat. And what you have in these places are like little villages. In Galilee, they're very close together, but they're little villages. And these little villages might have 10 or 12 families living together. And they would have no more than 5 miles away from the village where their plot of land would be, because they had to get there back in the day. And it was travel time. So they would have surrounding the villages these plots of land. And some were more fertile than others, so not everybody in the villages were equal. Some had better crops than others because their land was better. Now, for a village to survive, most of the diet consisted of bread made out of wheat flour and olive oil. Breakfast for peasants was dipping bread into olive oil. That was the main breakfast. There were other things. There were some fruit trees and some vegetables and some fish, but not much meat. So their diet depended. When you, in the prayer, give us this day our daily bread, that was survival. You got to hear that in the prayer. So in order for one person to survive for 1 year, it is estimated it would take a little more than a half acre of wheat for 1 year. For a family of 4, 6, or whatever, most of the village farms were 6 to 8 acres. If they had bumper crops, they could survive that year. Most didn't. And you needed, for enough olive oil, you would need another acre of very dense olive trees to make the olive oil, or else you had to figure out a way to trade it. Now, in the villages, they all tended, depending on what they grew and how well they did it, they could share things when they came back together. There was a cooperative society. So that what you have then is a kind of reciprocity. I do this for you, you do this for me, and everybody sort of looked out for each other in each little village. The difficulty is in trade and trying to get more than subsistence. How did you get your goods from one place to another? You couldn't hire a semi and drive it there. You couldn't get on the train. They didn't have many horses either. So what they had were oxen, donkeys, and some mules. Very slow, and they ate a lot. So you had to take some of your crop to feed your animals. So if you tried to transport your goods more than a 5 or 6 mile distance, the travel time alone would eat you up. Traveling and trading was bad. So what you have in here, you're trading goods, and you can't go very far because you can't haul the goods that far. Okay? So most of the village life of the first century starts off with bartering and trading. That was economically the way things worked. Now, the big cities, that was the places where they controlled the taxes and everything, and they had the people that did, they were out on the coast over here. There was no big cities in this region. And therefore, most of these places could get away without paying toll taxes. They could get away without paying rent taxes that they might impose on them. Even the temple tax couldn't get collected. There was no administrative way to do it. So you have Caesarea Maritima, which is where the Romans were housed, and you have Jerusalem, but no big cities in this region. So what happens in the first century? Herod, the great Herod, the King Herod, decides to build a big city. They build Sepphoris, 3 miles from Nazareth, a big city where the urban elite could go live. And they could then, in that part of Galilee, they had the resources there to start enforcing the tax codes and gathering stuff up. And then Herod Antipas builds on the Sea of Galilee the city of Tiberias, another big city in the year 27. And so Jesus' ministry comes with 2 big cities sitting in Galilee now, both of whom can control the countryside and can control taxes and rents and tolls and travel. You had to pay toll tax to get from one place to another. Most all of that meant that the small village farms, small farms, were having more and more difficulty surviving, not only if they had a bad crop, but they now had to pay more money in tolls and taxes because it was now being able to collect it because the urban centers were built to do that. That's why they built those cities. That's what cities were built for in the ancient world, to control the countryside. So the urban elite lived there. Now, what's happening is, as these people are struggling to survive, in order to have enough to plant the seeds for next year in a bad year, you had to borrow money. And the money was all located in the urban centers. That's where the rich people lived. So they go there and they collect money. And then you have to buy the seed and then try to make enough of a crop to have enough seed left over for the coming year so that you don't have to buy it again. And what happens is there's greater and greater indebtedness, and many of the small farms and villages are being bought out because in order to get the money on a loan, not only was there a loan, but there was a penalty for late fee, which was half the price of the loan. Many of the people then were losing the family farms. Villages were now closing down. People then became tenant farmers. They sold the land. So if I was a money speculator, I would make sure I bought somebody with enough price behind it that when they collapse, I get to buy their land. I have their land. I can now resell it to the urban elite who want to control it. Owning land is the wealth, because then you control it. The cities are places for consumers. They don't produce anything. They just eat everything out of the countryside. So the more you can control the countryside, the better off you are in the cities. Well, they were buying up property that was in full with debt. So if I wanted to make money, I would give an outrageous loan to a small farmer, and I'd have his farm within a year. And then I could sell it to the urban elite, and I could make money. That's the kind of thing you had to do. You had to continue to do that by exploiting the countryside where the peasants were, so they got poorer and poorer. They became tenant farmers, that is, they didn't own their land, but now they worked the farm and gave it to others. But many tenant farmers produced goods to survive. The people in the city, they don't want to produce wheat and oil. It's too hard to transport. What do they want? What's the easiest thing to transport? Money. So what you're having is a barter system in the village life in which there is reciprocity changing to a money economy run by the elite, because that's the way they can carry out their business and control things. So suddenly it's distributive justice only for the elite. And that's changing things. Now, there's one thing we haven't mentioned about the parable. According to the Torah, that is, what they saw as the law of God, what is the rule about charging interest on your money? Turning it over to a banker and collecting interest. Anybody know what the rule is?
10%.
What?
10%.
No.
You can't charge any.
It's against the law to get interest on your money. Usury is against the Torah. Non-capitalist. So what the guy does, the third guy does, he keeps it safe so it won't get lost. He refuses to exploit anybody, and he won't violate God's law of the Torah by collecting interest. He does everything he's supposed to do, and he gets blamed. You know, hearing the story a little differently? All of a sudden, then, what is happening is the parable is telling what is happening in terms of the greediness that is happening in the urban elite. The rich are getting richer by buying up the Galilean lands, and we know more and more of this was happening. What would be, besides the fact they became tenant farmers and day laborers, which we already ran into in another parable, what else would these people might do under those circumstances, which we saw last week?
Rebel.
What?
Rebel.
Rebel and become bandits, start doing robbery, thievery to survive. And that was happening too. So you have a whole cultural situation in which Jesus comes out of a small village of Nazareth. It was a small little village, maybe 200 to 300 people. His values are the values of the village. Share in common, help one another, reciprocity. His values are rooted in the Torah. The land belongs to God, and we have the privilege here of using it for others and not for our own benefit. When Jesus isn't even a farmer, he's an artisan, which is down from the farm. He's even poorer than the farmers. So he's coming out of that culture with that kind of values and that understanding of God's reality based on the Torah, confronted with a changing world of Roman domination and elite domination from the priesthood at the temple. Both of those were the elite groups, who were, in fact, the temple owned more land in Judea than anybody else. They owned the land. They owned the animals for the sacrifice. They were doing well. Remember, the temple isn't just a religious center, it's the political, economic, all those things all combined into one. So if that's the case, then the third person who claims that his owner is a greedy, despicable person is probably correct, because he wants greed. He wants the money. He wants a money crop. And that's where you would start changing wheat farms to vineyards, because wine, you could press the wine, take the wine, sell it, and that created a cash crop. So the whole economic, political, social structure of the first century in Galilee is changing radically, moving from a kind of traditional village sharing life to a moneyed economy run by the 8% who are the elite. Yes?
I'm wondering about the owner. He gave away the 5 talents that was his, plus the earning. That doesn't sound like greedy to me. And also, I wonder what his purpose was in doing this in the first place.
Well, according to it, he says trade with them, so he wants them to make money. And you're right, it doesn't say he's greedy. The third person accuses him of everything. So, but he clearly wants them to make money with it. That's what he tells them, to trade with it.
For what purpose? Not for his own
Make
use,
more, yeah.
because he gave it away.
Oh, I see, at the end, you mean where he gives the money to the person who earned it?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, he gives them all 10, he gives them 11 talents, you're quite correct, and that's the other side of the line. That is he greedy or not?
And why was they doing it in the first place is a question too.
The assumption of somebody doing it in the first sense with clients and servants is that's the way you run your businesses, if you will. It's a business transaction, that's right.
It was interesting to me, he didn't take the risk. He allowed his servants or what have you to risk.
Well, he risks only by giving them the money. He risks losing it if they lose it.
Yeah, but
He doesn't go out and do the dirty work himself to double the money.
Who's this parable for?
That's the million-dollar question we're trying to decide.
Yeah,
Part of the problem, and your question too, is who's the audience?
yeah.
And what is expected? Because part of the question is, what was the parable told for depends on who's the audience. The assumption, of course, is there's no indication anywhere in the New Testament that Jesus goes to Sepphoris or to Tiberias or any of the big cities. He goes to Jerusalem at the end, but that's about it. Most all of the places mentioned are little villages or little small towns, even Capernaum, which is bigger than a village, but nevertheless, it's a very small town. So he's dealing with peasants primarily, and not the urban elite. So this is not a story for the urban elite, and that's another problem because it would be very difficult for the people in his audience to be very sympathetic with the urban elite who are exploiting them. So on the one hand, if the story is about a test in which you either use your abilities and fail, or you're too fair you can't, that's one side of the line, or it's about greediness and exploitation in which the hearers of the parable are shown very clearly what happens to them given the particular situation they're in. And in this case, then, it would be not a positive statement about what the kingdom like, it would be a negative statement, this is not what the kingdom's like. And that's the two sides of the debate. Okay? There's no way to adjudicate this other than making some assumptions here. Yes?
Is it not quite a parallel to what is happening today?
Well, sure, there's a lot of parallels, particularly in third world countries as to what's going on.
Even here in our
Yeah,
country?
and of course, a lot of small farmers in this country are losing out to agribusiness. All that's true. So, part of the struggle is what's going on in the movement. Well, we're going to run out of time. Let's try the other side of the line for a minute, because we want an image too of a more well. There's two stories. We'll do one next time. We'll do the story about the dinner, the celebration at the dinner. It's in Matthew 22. Matthew 22, starting with verse 2. It's a story where the guy goes out and tells everybody come dinner, nobody comes, and everybody's allowed to come in at the end, that one. And then it's in Luke 14. It starts actually in verse 16, 14:16. And it's in Thomas 64, if any of you have Thomas's version, in 64. That's the story of the great dinner or feast, which I think most people argue is a positive statement of what life should be like if things worked out as Jesus intended them to work out in behalf of God. So, keep all these questions up in the air, because they're all the good questions you're asking. And we'll keep testing and see what it goes. The difficulty is, depending on the audience, the meaning of the story can change. I mean, you can just imagine, if you change audience, you're going to change perspective. And we don't know that. That's part of the problem. We don't have that information out of surviving history, so we have to deal with those.
Jim, was this an economy where there was a fixed amount of money?
Yeah.
And if Mr. A has some, then
Right.
Mr. B doesn't have it?
Right.
And
It's
they
not
don't-
just
they don't keep
it's not
any.
just money. It's everything. It's land, and even we'll see when we get into some other stories, honor. There's a certain amount of honor that you're born with, depending on where you are in the social hierarchy. If you start rising up to gain more honor, more prestige, more status, the only way you can do that is somebody else is going down the scheme. So everything is based upon a kind of limited goods and honor and prestige and value. And that's the competition that's going on all over the place. And we'll run into that more as we keep moving. Okay, don't lose sight of all this, but keep the political social situation in mind too, because that keeps raising questions.
And how come you didn't